The world is changing. People are asking why. But it may surprise you that the answers to your questions have already been written a long time ago. Welcome to the Rise Radio Podcast, where we discuss the latest world events, social narratives, and spiritual phenomena, all from a biblical perspective. Rise above the noise. Join us each week on your favorite podcast platform. Your worldview will never be the same again.
The culture in the West in today's world is very different than it used to be for our parents' and grandparents' generation. I'm sure I don't need to say that on this podcast, but we want to talk a bit about that today. The changes that have been happening in recent years, how fast the West just seems to be almost unrecognizable now to what it used to be in terms of some of the culture. And for this discussion, I invited on Andrew Stephenson, who is the director of CBR UK. We're going to talk about what CBR UK does towards the end of this episode. But since you, Andrew, do some work in the midst of this generation and with some of these prominent issues, it'd be great to have a discussion with you, what you see changing in society.
Yeah, thanks, David, and thanks for having me on.
So as a Christian, Andy, have you noticed a change in society today that perhaps has happened as the countries in the West have fallen further and further away from the gospel of Jesus?
Yeah, well, I would say that things have they've not progressed in a positive way. Things seem to be getting darker and darker. When hearts are turned from the one who gives life, the author of life, things become very grim. And as we've seen recently, and perhaps we'll talk about later, the darkness can actually seem quite overwhelming, and it's very difficult to find a sense of hope amongst all of that, because there is no solid source of hope. That there is we can't find that hope in government, in our leaders. So not only are things getting darker, even the very pointing to a solution isn't being sought anymore. And so it does feel, as you talk to people, like we've been kind of unmoored from the things that restrain us, and we're just being thrown about in the waves of the dark storms that are out of sea, the moral decline. And it certainly feels in this work, and when you talk to people, that things are on a very, very bad trajectory. And there's several things that we could perhaps look at that cause that. Yeah, it's easy to feel like we can only despair, when actually I think there is a sense of hope amongst it. There is hope in this storm, but it's not going to be found in any kind of human solution, but by obedience to Jesus and following him.
Yeah, and I know that we're going to go on to talk a bit more about the hope that you see in the midst of some of these really sensitive and difficult issues that we're going to talk about in a bit. But I just wonder, Andrew, because some of these issues, they have become so hyper politicized, is it difficult to navigate what is just politics and what is a real concern, and how to kind of confront those issues themselves?
Yeah, and I think that's why a lot of the work you've done, David, exploring this kind of false left-right paradigm it's captivated us even in churches, because it's what we constantly hear, it's what we're constantly being fed by the media, but also by a lot of Christian influencers. And I think we can fall into the trap of reacting to a problem. And if our reference isn't the word of God, and we're motivated, our course is set by opposition to the left or to the right, it is never going to bring us back onto course that is going to bring glory to God and bring security to us as a nation or as individuals. So it's so important that we identify very accurately what the problem is and what God says the solution is. And it isn't in that left-right battle. I find that so incredibly dangerous to get caught up in that. And you know, I myself have been prone to do that in the past. Mm-hmm. And it's very difficult to override those emotions and those reactions to who we perceive the enemy to be, which is in our minds so often in Christian culture, those horrible leftists. And it's such a distraction.
Yeah, because don't you find also that it can end up putting certain talking points into a box, and it's like, well, this is a left-wing issue or this is a right-wing issue. And it's like, you know, it's so easy to marginalize the opinion because but the thing is it reminds me where it says in the Bible that Jesus was full of grace and truth. So, you know, like, it doesn't belong to exclusively to either side. There is actually a narrow path that there is a balance of both.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think that what we saw last year with the tragic assassination of Charlie Kirk, I think things kind of upped to gear a little bit more, and not in a helpful way. So, for instance, again, going back to the labels and accurately describing things as they are, you have, I think, well-meaning Christian leaders talking about, you know, we need to get political. It's maybe just something that I find quite frustrating, that issues of justice are then being put in this, labeled as, if you hold this view on something, then you are, right of centre, or you're left of centre. No, justice is justice, particularly for our work, to see defending the unborn child being labelled as a right wing or a conservative issue, when it is an issue of justice. It brings it down to this level of politics, and then it can be discussed in that framework when God has something very clear to say about justice and what we do in those issues. And for that to be lost amongst the not particularly constructive discussions around left versus right, I think it's a big problem.
Of course, this topic is very sensitive. As you were saying off air, it's one that you like to, in your work, approach with grace at the forefront. Speaking about that grace and truth paradigm just a minute ago. And so we're going to move forward onto this topic, because we have to be careful how we word this. But just recently, the UK government has, I believe it's in the House of Lords, they've allowed the ending of that life in the pregnancy up to the point of birth. Is that correct?
That's sadly the situation. And I suppose, to put things in important order, and to back up what you're saying, David, it's, if there's people listening who have in some way been involved in pregnancy termination, and it's really difficult for me to use those kind of the algorithm approved phrases, because they really don't do justice to describe the situation accurately. But it's important that we're not hidden away amongst all the restrictions that the algorithms would bring. It's important to note that if you have been involved in this decision to end a pregnancy, either you yourself or you've advised somebody else to, just because we're discussing this and because we hold strong opinions on it, that you shouldn't be led to think that this is some kind of unforgivable sin. And I think quite often the silence of the church may have led people to think that, well, this is so bad, this must be the unforgivable sin, because nobody wants to talk about it. Actually, if you have asked for forgiveness, if you have repented of your sin, that work of Jesus is complete and you have been forgiven. This isn't the unforgivable sin. If you haven't asked for forgiveness, if you have been involved in this, then that is something, stop listening now and ask for that forgiveness. Get before Jesus and be confident in the completed work of Jesus Christ. And actually, even though it's a difficult issue, there is hope in it all as well. But so last week, the House of Lords, they had a vote on an amendment that went through. Initially, it was last year in 2025, and this was an amendment to the crime and policing bill, was to see the termination of pregnancy up to birth. It was an amendment to the crime and policing bill, and it was debated for, I think, a total of about 46 minutes in the House of Commons. And you compare that to something like fox hunting. That's quite a, obviously people have got their opinions on that, but that had about 700 hours of very vigorous debate on the morality of that. 46 minutes was given to this decriminalization of ending pregnancy up to birth, and it passed in the Commons. That the vote was 379 for this amendment and just 137 against. Several MPs abstaining from voting, and then it went through the various stages up to last week, where we had the report stage where they analysed what this would mean, and basically this came out as, this wasn't in the Labour manifesto. It wasn't called for by the public, but out of their what can only be described as kind of an anti-human ideology, they had a vote where a majority of the peers voted in favour of this amendment, and now it's going to be coming back soon to the House of Commons, where they'll have the ping pong, and unless there is some divine intervention or the king somehow refuses assent, we will have in this nation a situation where even at the point of giving birth, a woman will be able to end that pregnancy and there will be no consequences for it. How have we got here? How have we got here as a nation? This isn't something that people have been asking for. And in actual fact, it's really interesting, because we've been out on the streets and we found that even people who support ending pregnancy generally have just been shocked by it. That they say this is too much. This is the Westminster bubble, totally out of touch with public sentiment. We're just not reading the room. So there's something else going on there. They aren't reflecting the culture. And I think I don't imagine we've got time to get into it now, but if you look at the the history of the Labour Party, and effectively people who thought they were voting for Labour were actually voting for the Fabian Society. And if you look at their track record, the way they were founded, what they were founded on, it was essentially anti-human, anti-God, almost sort of worship of eugenics. And it's still that those things that seem to be driving this government and driving bills like this.
Yeah, their logo is the wolf wearing a sheep clothing, isn't it?
Yeah. And that sort of the tortoise, the slow creep, Fabian socialism's kind of creeping in, changed things gradually. This kind of revolution on the quiet, and that certainly reflects what happened. This bill, this amendment, kind of being cloaked in the crime and policing bill. The narrative being that this is to address one thing, which is it was done on the guise of, women are being arrested and imprisoned for ending their pregnancy, and we've got real concern and care for these women. It's a complete lie. It's a complete deception, totally characteristic of the Fabian values. If there was genuine care for women, if they were genuinely concerned about women, decriminalizing what they have decriminalized is the very last thing you would do to protect women, to protect society. And yeah, I think it's the ultimate, betrayal of women, and really exposes who is behind all of this ultimately. The Fabian Society have been used by this, but they aren't the enemy. They're certainly perhaps puppets for the enemy, but the architect of this kind of amendment is somebody who hates the image of God, who hates humankind and wants to bring destruction, who is a liar and a murderer.
Yeah, the thief comes only but to steal, kill, and destroy. And it's like you were saying, it always seems to so often come in a way that makes out it's for the betterment of people, and that it's for their good or it's for their convenience. And I've noticed also recently there's been the assisted dying bill being discussed in the UK as well. Do you think that's another similar thing that you're talking about?
Well, it's so similar. I mean, it was the same week last year that the Commons approved the assisted dying bill, the assisted suicide bill. It's that same anti-human agenda behind it all. If you don't have God as his parameters, his safety net, really, of his word, then you are going to have something else. That I can see there is no neutrality. By throwing the Bible out, you don't create a vacuum. Something else does rush in there, and it's not going to be good. So yeah, I think the assisted dying bill and the ending of pregnancy bill are totally in the same vein. Interestingly, though, there was more, I think, response, negative response about the assisted dying bill from many MPs and the social commentators. Unfortunately, recently in Scotland, that didn't get through. I think it was last Wednesday.
Yeah, I heard that.
That's really encouraging. But then the next day, in the House of Lords, we had the vote for decrim. And just to say, in balance, the encouragement in it was that there were some fantastic peers who made a really strong case, and there was a good number. The margin between the two sides wasn't as wide as I thought it could have been maybe a few years ago. But, obviously, I would have preferred a different result, but it could have been a total wipeout. The fact that there were some prepared to stand up was encouraging, and I think they are, even recently, they're trying to intervene to write to the Home Secretary and to put a pause on this thing, because there are so many things that haven't been looked at, so much evidence that's been ignored about the harm that it will do, that some kind of careful analysis of what's going to occur if this goes through, it just seems a reasonable step to take.
So has this also happened in New York? Because I seem to remember discussion about that in the last couple of years. Did they allow that as well up to birth, or was that not?
Yeah, well, I mean, America, it seems that, states have, various rules. And New York, like other states, is very extreme. Up to birth is, I think, you look at the reaction of those in New York when this was announced, this kind of celebration of being able to end pregnancy up to birth. And in my mind, it just looks demonic. It seems like a push globally. So not just New York and not just the UK, but the United Nations, based in New York largely, seem to be driving a lot of this agenda amongst countries who just are not asking for it. And that's particularly in countries that, certain African countries, the providers of this so-called service are kind of forcing it in through the back door and providing pregnancy terminations in countries where it's illegal. It never seems to be enough. So New York, the UK, it's got to be more. It's almost kind of a insatiable appetite that the enemy of our souls has. It's not just enough to end pregnancy early. It's got to be right up until birth, and there will be people who will celebrate that, like we saw in New York and other places. But I would say that those people, it looks like a loud voice, it looks like a majority, but it really isn't. But they do get the platform, they get they have the volume. But we shouldn't be led into thinking that is what a majority of people want at all.
There does tend to be that vocal minority that shout the loudest sometimes. And, hearing you talk about that, do you think we're getting into the territory of what used to happen in the Old Testament? There were issues back then where people would essentially serve false gods like Moloch and make sacrifices to idols. I mean, obviously, people don't necessarily knowingly advocate some of these things with that in mind, but do you think there are any parallels with this extremism we see today?
Yeah, 100%. I don't think it's similar to, but I think it is the same as. It is sacrifice. And that doesn't mean that these people knowingly are sacrificing to an idol, made of wood or stone. But the motivation, to sacrifice in the Old Testament, and it's to get something which we feel we don't have, that we have to lay down the life of another. Otherwise, it isn't, a sacrifice. It's a proof that the unborn child is actually valuable, or the born child in the case of. It's one of the things in the Old Testament that God seems to just pour out his wrath like you don't see in many other places, and commands his people not to do this. Even in Leviticus 20, I think, Leviticus 20 says God lays out the punishment for sacrifice, and fortunately we're not under Old Testament law in terms of punishment, but I think God's heart remains the same in the seriousness of sin. He says, any Israelite or foreigner residing in Israel who sacrifices any of his children to Molech is to be put to death. the members of the community are to stone him, I myself will set my face against him and will cut him off from his people. For by sacrificing his children to Molech, he has defiled my sanctuary and profaned my holy name. But then it goes on even further. So there's implication not just for those doing the sacrificing. I mean, that's bad enough. And yeah, in Jeremiah 19 and 32, God refers to as something that didn't even enter his mind. He didn't even think about it. He didn't command it. And it wasn't even something that the all-knowing God considered. But in Leviticus 20 carries on. It says, if the members of the community close their eyes when that man sacrifices one of his children to Molech, and if they fail to put him to death, I myself will set my face against him and his family and will cut them off from their people together with all who follow him in prostituting themselves to Molech. So it's obviously bad to wink the eye, to turn the eye, to know about it and do nothing about it also offends the heart of God. So it's, I think, recognizing it, what we have now, this ending of pregnancy, particularly now up to birth, infanticide is what it is. Recognizing it as sacrifice is important because it creates a moral duty, a response that we need to then have to it. Because if it is just kind of a
political thing,
if it's political, yeah, we can kind of opt in, opt out. Well, I'm not inclined towards any kind of political thing. No, if it's something that God didn't even imagine, that is so bad, then surely we have to act. And if there is something that we can do, if there is an action we can take, then there is also a moral obligation that we take it, that we speak up, that we, stand in the gap, that we hold back those staggering towards a slaughter, that we speak up for those who have no voice. That there is no option for just silence and just hoping it will go away, that it will resolve itself. Now, I would say that is the biblical response to it, not ignoring it, not categorizing it as just a political issue. There are lots of issues that Jesus talked about that could be classed as political, but they were also spiritual, and we need to see things the way God sees them, and at least try and feel his heart for some of these issues. And that's going to be good for the health of us. It's going to be good for the health of the church, and ultimately good for the lost to see that we care, that we don't just talk about loving our neighbor, but we demonstrate love for our neighbor by intervening when they are being the victim of the violence.
You mentioned in what you were just saying that this type of thing seems to bring a type of judgment. Do you think our nations are at risk walking into judgment nationally if there isn't repentance among people?
Yes, I think so. But it's interesting to look at, well, how long has this been going on? I find it difficult to think of a time, particularly with this discussion of kind of Christian nationalism, to look at a time when our country when we had it right. It's difficult to point of a time when we were a Christian nation. Certainly, I think we've been more influenced in the past by Christian values. And what we have now is a consequence of turning back on those values. And there is even a natural consequence of doing that. And I think God is certainly not going to bless us in the way we hope if our hands are covered in blood of innocents. If the churches we worship in on a Sunday morning have blood flowing through the sewers underneath them, how can God bless us? God, I think he wants to see a humble and contrite heart, but he wants to see us in our humility defending the cause of the orphan and the widow. And that just brings the natural outworking, the fruit of that has got to be good. I mean, even naturally speaking, that kind of makes sense. In a sense, what we have now is almost the judgment. God hands us over as we turn our back on him, as we harden our heart to him. He gives us over to our choices, to our sin and rebellion. And I think in his mercy to help try and wake us up, to make us see that the consequences of our action and the hope that, and the life and the light that he can bring, if we do turn to him, if we humble ourselves, if we get on our knees and say, God, we've sinned against you. I reckon that would lead to a much better society to be living in. But I don't think that can be forced by just demanding it. I think it has to be done through example, through being prepared to speak up, to not shy away from speaking truth. But I don't think, this is one of the things I'm quite nervous about, is that is quite different to what I hear a lot of people saying the response should be, that Christians need to get political, that our hope is in politics and changing the nation by force. That, I think, that's a whole other issue, and I don't think it's going to serve society well. But our obedience to God in things like how we treat our neighbour, I think that's going to be tremendously good for society.
So how do you, just bringing this discussion towards the end, how would you say that someone should respond to this in a healthy way without becoming part of this dominionist Christian nationalist movement that, maybe some of these issues can almost sadly be hijacked by those things? What is a correct response within that healthy realm?
Yeah, well, I think knowing what God says about justice, what God says about loving our neighbor and taking it seriously, you can understand people getting caught up in the emotion of it and thinking the right response is, well, it's for me to intervene here, to be the solution. If our motivation is to kind of take power back, to be the ones who dominate, like these kind of dominionists, rather than laying our lives down for the weak, for the vulnerable, for those being downtrodden and oppressed, then we're essentially saying we can handle this because we think we can take control of the situation. We can take responsibility for bringing a change. But actually, there is a pattern of loving our neighbor proactively. So it isn't by getting caught up in the weeds of politics. It's by speaking truth, absolutely, not shying away from that, but putting others before ourselves, putting the unborn child, seeing them as our neighbor, not just as a blob of tissue, but as our brother, as our sister, who we are to protect. Yes, I mean, there's plenty of examples that we can see in the Bible of seeking justice, of defending the oppressed, and that gives them a voice. The unborn child has no voice unless we speak up. They can't defend themselves, so we must defend them. And that's got to be done in humility, but in truth as well. We need to love our neighbor as ourselves, ultimately. And like in the parable of the Good Samaritan, where Jesus commends the Samaritan for helping somebody he wouldn't naturally maybe be inclined to help, Jesus ends that parable with go and do likewise. So I think to take God seriously about that, and on Judgment Day, when we stand before him, and we're not saved by works, certainly, but when God says, what did you do to help the weakest? What did you do? That there is none more weak than the unborn child. I think we're in fairly safe territory if we speak up, and we teach in our churches who the unborn child is and what's happening to them. We encourage others to do the same, to help women in unplanned pregnancies. But we take God seriously about being a voice, and we trust him in these sort of perilous and dark times. We aren't given to that temptation of we've got to take control of this. We've got to take dominion over these areas. That isn't going to help. There are activities, there are things that people can do, that there's no excuse for inaction. If people are listening and they think, I'm just outraged that our government could pass such a heinous law, then don't just give in to despair. Because the encouragement in all this is, as we go out, as we show people the truth, and we see this all the time in our work, as we take these images, which are large images of living unborn children and unborn children who've had their lives ended, as we take this stuff out onto the streets, we see people change their minds all the time about this issue. And so often it leading to amazing conversations about the bigger questions of life, and, you know, getting a chance to share the gospel with them. So it can look dark, it can look like it is a done deal, but don't give in to that, and know that people out there, our neighbors, your friends, their thinking can be edified by your clarification and loving, truthful commentary on this situation. So get yourself versed in how God feels about the unborn child, how he feels about sacrifice, and our responsibility to, like the early Christians who went out to gather in those who've been left to perish in the elements. That's a good thing for us to be doing. And you can be doing something like that today. You know, we've seen, just a couple of weeks ago, we had a report back of our team out who were out in Kent. They were just showing on the street these two very contrasted images, the living and the non-living child. This young teenage girl was with her friends and came up to talk to the team. And it was the usual kind of heated outpouring that we would dare do such a thing. And anyway, she went off and she came back. She said, "Oh, I want to debate you on this." And then she went off again. She came back and she just brought up all the usual things that we can think are overwhelming. There's no answer to. But what about, you know, grape? What about, you know, all these difficult cases? And we can feel overwhelmed by this issue and how complicated it can seem. But our educator who was on the display, she just calmly responded with questions. Generally speaking, that's a good way to handle these things, and kept bringing it back to who the unborn child was. And this girl went off again. Then she came back and she said, "Well, you've saved a life today. I'm pregnant, and I was booked in. I was gonna get rid of my baby, but I'm gonna keep it now." And it was beautiful because a few moments later, her boyfriend, who was also in town, he really wanted her to continue in the pregnancy. He came back and he shook the hands of all the team members there. He was so grateful that his child was now protected by the truth that people who were just out there on a Saturday morning were prepared to share. And so people are persuadable on this. So we don't need to wait until we've got dominion. We don't need to wait till we've taken the mountain or the sphere of politics. There is something we can do now just by being a witness against evil, by speaking truth in love. We can literally save lives. And despite what happens in Parliament, if this gets royal assent, I don't think that it's a complete done deal, because the way I think we change this is by changing public opinion, and to see that change, even despite what the law says, even if it is absolutely atrocious, if we've won the hearts and minds of enough people in society, I think we can then bring pressure to bear just through public opinion to see this thing corrected. And I think in doing so, I think God will honor that. I think that's going to be something that leads to people asking the questions of what is morality? Why is this thing wrong? And again, time and time again, we see that leading to people asking questions about human value and why their life is actually important, and the lives of their unborn children. So rather than being discouraged, if you are discouraged over what's going on, take responsibility. Don't try and take dominion. Take responsibility to do something to protect others, because they're real positive things that you can do to push back, that don't look like getting involved in the left-right battle, that are just about standing up for justice.
Thank you, Andrew. I really appreciate your sharing your thoughts and encouragements on this topic. It's been really insightful. Where can people find your website and everything? You're director of CBR UK, and you work on this stuff a lot. So where can people check you out online?
Yeah, so if you go to cbruk.org, then there'll be a contact us point on that page. You can go to cbruk.com/join. We're on Instagram and Facebook and all the rest of it. We would love to hear from people. To make a real change in this, you don't need to be hero having everything together. I think if God can use me to see lives saved, to really challenge the status quo, there is no excuse not to get involved yourself. Just you can only be encouraged by by being obedient to God and having a willingness to get involved. You could make a massive difference and be in opposition to evil.
Andy, thanks for joining us on Rise Radio.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you, David.